I've been doing Python for about 8 years, and today I'm going to be showing you the most common Python mistakes that beginners make and how to fix them. So let's go. First thing you want to do is stop what you're doing and go, whether you're on your phone or your laptop, to Google Colab. And you can type in Google Colab into your search bar. And this is going to be basically like our Google Docs, but for coding. So I'm going to go here and start a new project. And the way that I'm going to teach you the top 10 mistakes is by making the mistakes within a project. So this is going to be a very simple follow along, but I'm going to be committing these mistakes and showing you how to fix them. So first thing I'm going to do is retitle this to 10 most common Python mistakes. And I'm going to be committing each mistake here as we go. So the first common mistake is to not use formatted strings. And a formatted string is a much easier, cleaner way that if you want to print something for the users to see, that you can inject a variable. So let's say we've created a variable that's a counter. It goes 1, 2, 3. There is a much cleaner way to do this. And let's say, not necessarily bad, but the less clean way is to say something like, what is your name? So we write name is enter your name into an input. And then let's print my name is, and then people typically put plus name. So there's two mistakes with this, which is, we'll put number 1. Formatted strings. There's two mistakes with this, which is if I run it, here it will ask for my name and it will print it out. But can you see how it's confusing? That there's no space here, and you'd think that this would work. So if I write this here, and I say Jeff, here what you see is because it's written in this way, it's hard for you to actually tell if a space is needed. So first of all is putting the space here, but there's actually a cleaner way of being able to do this. So here you see that there is a space, and here as well. And so if we write that this is the bad way, the good way of doing it is actually using formatted strings. So if I copy this, which is totally good, the nicer way is with a formatted string that you can write F and then quote marks, and then you can write something like my name is, but then you can actually put in these curly brackets the variable that you want. And it then allows you to put various variables. So I can put the name twice here, for example, or another variable. And it just makes it a lot cleaner because I know where the spaces are and everything. So if I print this and I write Jeff, it's printed it perfectly here. So that's how you use an F formatted string, and that is what a more advanced Python person may be using. So I'm going to write here the good and the bad. So there we go. That's how we've done it. And now let's jump into number 2. So number 2 is using a lot of people starting off in Python have not used some of these data structures like dictionaries. And dictionaries are some of the most useful ways to store information, particularly because it's so fast. And we can jump in another video why it's so fast. But it's actually really useful, and people tend to use lists instead. So let's say that we're using all of this to make, for example, a money bot that tracks your expenses, right? And one mistake that I might do here is that I will use a list instead of a dictionary. So the bad way to do it, which I'll write here, is that I could start off by trying to make all of my expenses. So I'm going to write all of my expenses in this expense tracker in a list. And so I can write something like a list of lists here where I have the start off with rent, and this is like $100. So this is a list with several items in it. Then I might do food, and the food is 300. And then I might do fun. is 150. So I can go and like have all of this written this way, right? And have a list where I track everything. But what it means is if I'm actually going to extract this and put it into a new coding block, just so I have more space. So I can run this and it runs all of this, right? But let's say that I want to find the specific rent expense. I would have to do something a little bit more complicated. Like I have to do for expense. Oh, it's typed it out actually here perfectly. For expense and expenses, if the expense 0 is rent, then print the expense. So if I run this, it'll say the rent is 100, but it has to go through everything to find it. And so that's where there is a much more efficient way of doing this, which this is the more bad way, and the good way, which I'll just copy this good tag, is instead to store it in a dictionary. So here it's already auto-completed it, but let's say that we take the same information and instead of storing it like this, we're going to put curly braces and we're going to store it in a dictionary. And so we're going to say something like rent. If you get asked about rent, it's 100. If you get asked about food, it's $300. If you get asked about fun expenses, it's 150. And you start to see how this is a much cleaner way of doing it. And instead of having to write this complex and slow code, if I want to find the amount that I spend on rent, I can just do expenses, square brackets, which means I'm indexing, I'm looking up this value. You can think of a dictionary, you look up a word and you get the definition. So here we look up this word and we get its defining value. So here it says 100, which is what we've spent on rent. So dictionaries are a super useful structure to store your data. And I would, a lot of times, if you have to look things up really quickly, look at dictionaries instead of lists or arrays. So that's the number 2. Now we'll jump into mistake number 3, which is hard coding values instead of making functions. So let's say that here now for my expense tracker, so hard coding values instead of using functions. So let's say we're doing this expense tracker in which we're making all of these silly mistakes, right? And we'll start off with this bad one, the bad example again, which is, let's say now we make a list with all of the expenses that we have here, right? And we say expense list equals. And we could, for example, here was the expense rent, but we can do expense rent plus expense fun plus expense food. And we could start to make it so that this is how you have the, oh, this is the total expenses. And you can start to have it this way, but let's say that you add an expense, then you have to update this, you have to update this. It's actually quite a hard way to be able to update this function, and it starts to be a bit confusing. It's not very scalable. So a better way of doing this is to do the following, which is to write a function. So you can write a function called, for example here, define calculate total. And here you get the expenses in. And what you do is you return, for example here, the sum, which sum is a function, of expenses, which are these expenses. And then you can write dot values. So values means that it will take, these are known as the keys in a dictionary, all of these labels, right? It's like the lookup word if you think of a real dictionary like a book. And the values is what that word corresponds to. So if I take the values, it will give me 100, 300, and 150. And so then if I just do it like this, I can then print out the function and I can give it this expenses dictionary. And there we go. We've created a reusable function here, which can be used instead of having this long format of doing that, which means if I add another expense here, like random 100, and I rerun this, and I rerun this, you see that this is automatically updated because it's pulling all of the values here. Whereas here I would have a wrong answer because I'm supposed to add this random every time I update this list. So this is a much more maintainable way of doing it. Next, mistake number 4 is not using loops. So some people, when you start off Python, you don't think as much about functions. And functions are ways that we can reuse stuff and scale stuff instead of manually copy pasting. This is the whole point of programming, is how do you make things reusable and scalable so that you don't have to constantly write everything manually, right? Else we wouldn't have computers. So let's say that the bad way of doing it here would be to do something like the following, which is we want to print, we're going to use this nicer method, right, that we showed last time. Rent is, and then we will write expenses rent, like this. So if I run this, it says it's unmatched. I think I have to write like this because there's quotes already. So it says rent here, but let's say that I then want to print all of these other ones. So I'm just going to do here, for example, rent. I'm doing Command D to copy both of these at the same time, but you can just copy them one by one. Fun, random, and what was the other one, like food. So I can do this and copy paste it, but it doesn't become very scalable because the moment I add another value like random, it's not a very scalable way to do the code. So I'm going to comment this out and show you the good way. And the good way of doing this is to write a function. So you can write something like for category in expenses. So this will go through each of these labels in the expenses, right? So you say for category in expenses, and this is how you create a loop. You say print f string category, and then you do expenses category. So if I print this now, you see that I've done what I could do in 4 lines instead in 2 lines, right? Because it's printed everything, because it's gone through every category here in this dictionary, every label. And then it said for each one, I want to print the name like this. And then the value, which is the value you look up like a dictionary, right? You put in the word like rent and it looks up the value. So that's how you get the value. So we found a 2-line way to make this code so much more scalable and clean without having to copy. So this is how you use loops. This is called a loop, where you loop through all the values. Next mistake is number 5, which is not handling user input correctly. So let's look first at the bad example, which is, let's say that you have a new expense and you say input is enter expense. And you write the new amount. Or let's say that you have a new expense amount here. Oh, let's say that you have a new expense and then new amount, enter amount. And then you do something like print 1 plus the new amount, right? And so what I'm trying to do here is this is the label and this is the actual amount that we spend. So let's say like random 2, and then we do 100, like 1,000. You see that it gives an error. And I'm like, why? Because I've typed in a number. What happens with these inputs is that even if you type a number, it thinks it's text, right? It's the wrong, like it interprets it as the wrong format. And so what's being done wrong here is I'm assuming that this value that I'm getting from this user input is a certain type. I assumed it was a number, but it was actually a number, but written in text format. And so this is what, when you get an input from a user, you want to be validating it correctly. You want to make sure it's in the right format. So the good way of doing this is we'll do a function here, and we'll say get valid number, and you get an input, and you'll say try, which means that it'll try to do something. So if it gets an error, you can return something. And you say return float input, which means we convert the input into a number. But if it can't be converted into a number, it will give an error. And so if it gives an error, this is what we'll say: accept value error, print please enter a valid number. And so this is how we can start to validate inputs. So I'm going to copy this code that I had before, but with the new amount, I'm now going to put the new amount and have get valid number here is the new amount. And so I can put this here. So now if, well, actually I'll print this 1 plus this number again, just to show you that it works. But this is a validation function that we've written. And here is the code from before. So if I write the new expense of random stuff, and it's 1,000, you'll see here that now it says 1,001. So it's added 1,001 together. But the reason is that it's converted, it uses this float function to convert this amount that was in text and convert it into a number instead. And I'll just show you the other mistake, which is, so if I do random stuff, but if I in the mount write random, it'll say, please enter a valid number, which is the error that we expected. So you can think of this almost like a bodyguard. It's only going to let in the right values in, and you want to be bodyguarding your code to make sure you're only getting what you want. Mistake number 6 is overwriting an existing function that already exists. Number 6 is accidentally overwriting an existing function that already exists. So existing function. So for example, if I do define sum, so I'm creating a new function, a and b, but let's say that I do sum is like a plus b times 2. What might happen is that I start to confuse things because sum is a predefined function within Python. So if I don't write this, and I write something like sum 1 and 2, so one of the problems is that, so if I do print and then I do here an array where I do sum 1 and 2, it'll give me 3. But if I overwrite this Python function that's already been written, and I write print 1, 2, as you can see here, it'll give me 5. So one of the problems here is that if I overwrite this function with the same, if I write this function with the exact same name, and then somewhere else in the code, I'm already defining that function, like here we've written sum, what will happen is that I will overwrite to the other function as well. And this can create a lot of problems. So really in any programming language, you really want to avoid writing a function with the exact same name. And I might write here sum b times 2. And so when I use this, at least I can use it like this, but also then I can use the sum function as I actually wanted to use. So this is a common one, and you want to just avoid existing function names. So this is the good way of doing it. And the bad way is to name it as the function that already exists. So here, if we use that sum name. Cool. So that is how we do number 6. So here were different mistakes and errors, most common ones that I see beginners make. Hopefully you've learned a lot from this. We started off with formatting strings and ways to make it cleaner using this F format instead of doing these pluses. We also learned a way to use dictionaries instead of for loops to make it much more compact and easy to use and reusable. We learned to not hard code values, but instead make functions that scale and make it so we don't have to rewrite all of these things. We then, instead of copy pasting, we learned about loops and to reuse loops. We learned how to validate numbers coming in, which is helpful so we don't get errors. We learned to not use the same names as existing functions like sum. Please let me know what you'd like to see in future videos, and all the best on your Python journey. Thank you.